It's now time for The Journal, WBGU-TV's award-winning public affairs program, with your host, Steve Kendall. This is where your community matters. Local people, local issues.
Hello and welcome to Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. The 2018 election is now less than a week away. Ohioans will vote on numerous local issues, elect a U.S. Senator, and fill state offices from governor to state reps and state senators. They'll also decide the fate of State Issue 1. Joining us to an election preview from the BGSU Department of Political Science are Dr. Melissa Miller, Dr. Nicole Kalaf-Hughes, and Dr. David Jackson. I want to thank you all for being here. Got you guys, the band, back together to talk politics, which we do every time an election rolls around. I mentioned the U.S. Senate race, and that's the one that seems to have taken the highest profile besides the governor's race and State Issue 1. But let's talk a little bit about that race, because you got an incumbent senator, Sherrod Brown, and you've got a challenger, Jim Renacci. So what's the feel for what's going on with that race right now?
Well, I think that the Republican Party definitely targeted Sherrod Brown and wanted to pick off this seat and shift it from the blue column to the red column. Why? Because Donald Trump won the state of Ohio just 2 years ago by almost 8 percentage points. Having said that, right now, race conditions look very favorable for the incumbent Democrat, Sherrod Brown. The most recent poll of polls indicates that Brown is up by about 16 percentage points. That is sizable. Right. And so I think Jim Renacci has his work cut out for him. There's a lot to be said about this very dramatic race. One thing that I want to mention up front is that Jim Renacci got into the race very late. Okay. And so while a lot of attention will be paid to his close association with President Trump and whether this, what appears to it might be, a big Democratic win, might it say something about 2020? Well, Jim Renacci had a real disadvantage. Why? Because he was initially running for governor. And what happened was that Josh Mandel, who was challenging Sherrod Brown, our state treasurer, unexpectedly dropped out of the race, citing his wife's health conditions. And so sort of at the last minute, the Republicans needed to come up with a candidate. The White House urged Jim Renacci to move from the governor's race to the Senate race, which he did. He did not declare for U.S. Senate until January of this year. That is very late. Wow,
so that does put him, almost behind, way behind to begin with, fundraising, everything.
Absolutely,
right?
And he has been outraised by Sherrod Brown. What I've read, and this is public, of course, because of the campaign finance law, you have to file quarterly. He's been outraised by Sherrod Brown by about 4 to 1. Money does not always make a difference. Just ask Hillary Clinton or Steve Forbes, some high profile candidates who've run for president, but that's been a disadvantage as well. Right.
Now, in terms of that race, and obviously Sherrod Brown is a Democrat who has a lot of party views, but also it isn't necessarily a party line Democrat either. Is that working for him in his favor or not? Because Ohio is sort of this swing state, still is, and in this era, is that an advantage for him then to sort of be more a moderate Democrat as opposed to a pure blue left-wing Democrat?
I think because Ohio is so split, and I think Ohio likes the variety of opinions, at least that exist. I think that helps a little bit. He doesn't get the national attention that some other Democratic senators do. That's not always favorable, and so I think that helps, at least in this instance.
Yeah, he's never been in favor of free trade the way that the modern Democratic Party has, which matches him well with his state. Right. He's a pretty liberal guy when it comes to most issues, but I think it's fair to speculate that if he actually wins by 16 percentage points, that he may consider taking a run at 2020 in terms of the presidency. It'll be a free shot for him since he'll be partway through another 6-year term. He'll automatically be interesting to Democrats in the base because he's so progressive on so many issues. And coming from a state that's so competitive, like Ohio traditionally has been, the bellwether state, I think he'll get a serious look.
Now Jim Renacci, because he started so late, but secondly, he's never been a statewide office holder, so he's got some identification issues, or at least a sort of awareness issues as well for the typical voters. Like the name doesn't immediately pop up when you think Ohio politics.
That's correct. Now, Jim Renacci was a two-term mayor of Wadsworth in Northeast Ohio, but that's a small town, city. You know, it's relatively small. He has since 2011, I believe it's 2011, he has represented Ohio's 16th congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. Strangely enough, that's the district in which I grew up. So it is a red district. This is Wayne, Holmes County, parts of Wayne and Holmes County, Wadsworth, of course, and now, what is Jim Renacci known for? One of the things that he's most known for is being one of the earliest public elected officials at the national level to endorse President Trump. And what's so interesting is that I think we fully expected, I think people like us would have expected that he would continue to embrace Trump, but as recently as last week, he's made clear he is going to embrace Trump to the end, even though he's behind, even with the events of last week, the mail bombs sent to Trump critics. He was asked at the Senate debate, the last one that was held at Miami University just a few days ago, whether President Trump should tone down his rhetoric. Jim Renacci in that debate took the opportunity not to answer the question, but to express his support for the president. So I think that made clear he's going to embrace the president to the end. And I think the strategy is without Trump's supporters, Jim Renacci is in real trouble. But it's a challenge, I think, for candidates running not just in Ohio, but elsewhere, how closely to embrace a president who is polarizing. You either love him or you hate him. I mean, that's what people said the same thing about Hillary Clinton. We've had polarizing politicians before. He's one of them. So he's continuing to embrace the president all the way to the end of the race.
Now, one of the things that has become an issue, or at least seems to be an issue, not just in Ohio, but in a lot of places, is dealing with whatever is now left of the Affordable Care Act, or how that's all functioning. Because, and I don't know, I assume that Jim Renacci wasn't a supporter of that when it came through the House of Representatives years ago. But at the same time, you've had some elected officials who oppose that now, are a little less in opposition now that they're running for different offices. And we've seen that, I think, in the governor's race a little bit as well, with the Medicaid part of the Affordable Care Act. Is that at all in play in the Senate race at all, or not? Has that become an issue? If it is, it seems like it's fairly low, and yet around the country, you see polls that say Medicare, health issues are a big thing for all candidates, and yet I don't know that it's been a big issue between these two guys.
Well, I don't think it's been a big issue in the race. I think for the Senate race, well, let me back up and say that healthcare is the #1 issue. What the polls show of Ohio voters is that there are 3 issues that are essentially tied for being the most important. #1 is healthcare. 1 point behind is the president himself as an issue in the race, and 2 points behind that is jobs in the economy. So, but what does that tell you? There's a real, there's not, this isn't like 2008, right, where healthcare was the issue. And I would say the Senate race has been more dominated by personal attacks. That's what's getting through to voters, is the personal attacks and the negativity, more so than the issues.
Well, Democrats have been saying since the passage of the Affordable Care Act that once its provisions take hold and people receive the benefits of the plan, they're going to become in favor of it. It took a lot longer than they expected it to happen, but a majority of Americans now support the Affordable Care Act's protections of things like coverage for pre-existing conditions. And you've seen that in the governor's race being, just hammered as the issue.
Well, and I think it's a little bit less salient here than it is in other states, because even under a Republican governor, Ohio took the Medicaid expansion. And Ohio embraced it a little bit more than other majority Republican states. And so I think it's a little bit less salient here than it is in some other states, because we accepted it under a Republican governor. Ohio already had the extension of kids on their parents' insurance longer than the national average was, even prior to the Affordable Care Act. So I think some issues have always been individually popular in Ohio, even if people might not have loved the packaging or the terminology. Ohio actually embraced the policies more than other states.
When we come back, let's talk about the governor's race, because that's the other high. The other state races, some of the names are not as familiar, but that one at least we've got some people we recognize, I guess. We'll be back in just a moment. We're talking election 2018 here on The Journal. Thanks for staying with us here on The Journal. When we left that last segment, we just sort of started to touch on the governor's race. The other state races down the line aren't quite as, don't have quite the same profile. But the governor's race, we're going to elect a new governor. The incumbent, John Kasich, is not eligible to run again. And we have Mike DeWine and John Husted, some familiar names in Ohio, running on the Republican side, and a couple of familiar Democrats, Richard Cordray and Betty Sutton. So let's talk a little bit about where that race stands kind of at the moment.
If you look at the polling data for that race, it's actually pretty close, almost within the margin of error. I've seen a couple polls that put Cordray ahead, but I think that almost all of those, the amount that team is ahead essentially is within the margin of error of the poll itself, so it's not statistically meaningful in terms of prediction. And we all know that polls can be wrong. So.
Sure.
And in that respect, it's sort of a replay of their 2006 race for Attorney General. Mike DeWine narrowly beat Richard Cordray by just under 2 percentage points for Attorney General. So it's kind of like deja vu all over again. Here we have two candidates with deep resumes, and again, it's too close to call.
Now,
I think one of the interesting things that's happening in that race that you could look at from sort of a national perspective has been a claim I've seen a lot of pundits making, that the Democrats haven't been making a closing argument nationally. That Trump's been out there nationwide making a closing argument about the immigrant caravan, about violence, that the Democrats haven't responded to that. But I think if you look at elections like the Cordray-DeWine election, Rich Cordray has stayed laser-like focused on the issue of healthcare, specifically his assertion that Mike DeWine has been opposed to the preservation of coverage of pre-existing conditions, and Cordray and Sutton's full support for that. I think that's the closing argument. I think that what we're seeing is a smart campaign in the sense of not responding to every ebb and flow and provocation that comes at the candidate from the presidential level, but instead staying focused on their message, which has been their message from day one, which has been about health care, and that is their closing argument. And I believe that nationwide in congressional elections, which are primarily local affairs, governor's elections and Senate elections, closing arguments are being made that don't necessarily respond to the president's framing of what the closing argument issues ought to be.
Now, a question maybe for all of you. I mean, as you said, these are people with deep resumes, all four of them. In this day and age, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because we know that in some cases, it used to be that was a good thing. Oh, you've got this record, you're an incumbent, you've got experience, you've been there, you've done this. But that now seems to be somewhat of almost a handicap in some ways.
Although in the case of the governor's race, it's sort of a moot issue because they both have deep resumes, as do their lieutenant governor running mates. Certainly, I think, yes, after President Trump was elected, that never having run for public office before, and to be honest, I mean, we've seen for decades that candidates, even those with deep resumes, try to run as outsiders because American voters, including Ohio voters, tend to look suspiciously on quote-unquote career politicians. In this race, again, as in the Senate race, and
they're
virtually
all career politicians.
They're all. But I do think. Touching on some of what Dave had to say is that it's the combination of the deep resume. I think DeWine and Cordray are policy wonks. Maybe Cordray a little bit. Cordray maybe even more so perceived that way. He's a former Jeopardy champion, so it kind of feeds a wonkish image. But I think that race from the start was going to be pretty policy focused. And to tell you the truth, that's really what all candidates around the country should be doing. It's generally in the best interest of candidates running for local, even statewide races, to let the national be the national and ignore. And Rob Portman in 2016 is a good example of a campaign where he really localized. It was almost as if he was running for governor on Lake Erie, on algal blooms, the health condition of Lake Erie, the opioid crisis and the like. So that was kind of, I know after his win, a lot of people said that's really, it's a model for Republicans, but I'd argue it's also a model for Democrats.
For basically anyone running for elected office.
Right, to try to tune out the national, because the bottom line is voters in Ohio and elsewhere, what we get, the negativity in politics, it is at the there's so much more at the national level, and cable news, every night you can turn it on, and it's so much negativity. It's the voice, a Republican voice pitted against a Democratic voice, and those voices tend to be the more extreme in the parties.
Sure.
That's why they've got the invitation to bring the drama to cable news. And so I think it is good to see that voters have two good choices here, two well-qualified candidates, and it really does come down to those issue differences, to the importance, how important is the issue of health care, coverage of pre-existing conditions. Voters where that's their big issue are probably going to lean more toward Cordray. I think for DeWine, the big issue where he's gotten traction is on the testing of the rape kits. And I think that was, that is a big accomplishment of his as Attorney General, and he can pivot that against his immediate predecessor in that office and say, you didn't test the rape kits. Actually, many before had not. But I've been pleased to see, here's the race, the kind that voters say they want about the issues, this is it.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to, and those, DeWine and Cordray have debated several times. There was a push, because Toledo, of course, Northwest Ohio always feels like they're left out of this. How much of it, and Cordray was saying, yeah, I'll debate you in Toledo, name a spot, I'll be there. How big are debates in terms of if somebody says, look, we've debated 3 times, I'm not going to debate a 4th time, does that sway voters one way or the other, people who are undecided, or is that simply just politics being politics, say, hey, you don't show up for a debate, that means you're a bad guy or something? How does the debates really play that big a role unless somebody makes a really bad mistake, or are people sort of already set in their ways in terms of who they're going to vote for?
It can really depend on whether any debate has happened. There's a big difference between going from 3rd to 4th versus no debates at all to 1. But a lot of it has to do with, you can swing some, but a lot of it has to do with just doing adequate versus a huge gaffe. You're not going to get a lot of credit for doing well, but you'll
definitely pay
poorly,
the price for doing poorly. Sure.
It was certainly a valiant attempt by the Cordray campaign to say that there ought to be a debate in Toledo or Northwest Ohio.
Right.
Lucas County and Toledo are home to a whole lot of Democrats, a whole lot of union members, a whole lot of people that the Cordray campaign needs to show up to win for them. So I wonder if the claim had been, oh, you didn't do a debate in Central Ohio in the most Republican county, if the Cordray campaign would be as strongly endorsing the need to do that. But certainly attempting to create a sense of playing upon the ways in which people in Northwest Ohio sort of do feel like an afterthought when it comes to statewide politics. It's probably a smart choice, get a few more Democrats to show up in Lucas County.
And of course the newspapers have yet to make their endorsements, at least in the governor's race yet, and I wonder if that will play into that. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see, because of course I know that the one newspaper said, hey, we'll be glad to host it. They were all for that, so we'll see how they come down now in terms of endorsing, if they endorse a candidate. When we come back, let's talk a little, because State Issue 1 is out there, and it's both confusing, depending on, you can see 2 definite determinations, 2 separate sides of that. So we need to kind of talk about that, because that's one of those issues. It's a constitutional amendment. It's going to be there kind of forever if it goes in. So we come back. Let's talk about State Issue 1. We come back here on The Journal. Thank you for staying with us here on The Journal. We're talking about the 2018 election. One point before we move on to State Issue 1, and it's rather important. The governor, under the new redistricting law that's in place, has veto power over the redistricting plan that will come out of that new committee. has that been a discussion point with voters, really? That's sort of a below the awareness line kind of thing, but it's a very important aspect of who becomes governor. I
don't know if it's something that is necessarily salient in terms of with the general population, but I think it's something that's at least worth thinking about. We'll do the census again in 2020, and then every state will be responsible for redistricting both their congressional and state legislative seats, and every state gets to decide how they do that. And in Ohio, the governor has the ability to veto any of these congressional district proposals that come forth, and they actually sit on the commission that decides the state legislative seats. So they have a pretty big role in deciding the shape of all of our districts, which will matter for the next 10 years. So regardless of how long the governor serves, whether it's one term or two, they're going to have an influence in state and national politics for
through 2030.
Yeah, until we do the next census.
Yeah, so it's a pretty big decision. Sure.
And I think there was definitely awareness raised in 2017 because there was the issue on the ballot. I'm forgetting what number it was. But there was an issue on the ballot, and voters overwhelmingly passed that ballot measure to try to bake in more bipartisanship into that redistricting process. And certainly under these new rules, the threshold is higher. You have to get a higher, some level of minimal minority party support in the Ohio House and Senate before you can even pass such the plan. And we'll see. I've always been skeptical that partisanship can be taken out completely of this process, regardless of the rules you set up. So we'll see. It's untested. But I do think in that ballot measure in 2017 raised awareness that it really does matter for both, as Nikki said, both state and national level politics for 10 years, because it's the governor, some additional statewide office holders who they get to decide how the districts will be drawn, and they can definitely, the technology, everything is available. Absolutely, red districts and blue districts can be drawn, and so the critique is that that allows candidates to pick the voters instead of voters to pick the candidates. So I think awareness is high in terms of this vote in these particular midterms matter a great deal.
And other states have done similar things. Some have gotten even more creative, but typically the majority party gets their way, and that's something to kind of know and be aware of. Is the reason kind of you see majorities continuing and you don't see a lot of changing at the state level is because they do pick their constituents.
And if you look at the districting map in Ohio, it's a very creative looking work. It's a very artistic looking work.
That is true.
Some of it not very geometrically good, but it is what it is. And so those are the kind of things that will happen. And as you said, what will happen in 2020 will be there until 2030. So it does sort of, that governor will put a stamp on that, which will follow him or her long after they're out of office. State issue 1, it's a constitutional amendment, and it says to reduce penalties for crimes of obtaining, possessing, and using illegal drugs. That's the title of the issue 1. That's one that you see ads that say this is the end of the world if you pass this. The other one saying this is the beginning of a new world if we pass it. It's a confusing issue for people, it seems. And I guess when you have an issue like that, how do voters typically react in that situation if they don't fully understand what's going to go on there? And this is a constitutional amendment, so it's there in perpetuity basically once it goes in. So what's the feel for how voters will react to that if they're not clear on how they want to vote on that?
Well, I think the tendency when there's uncertainty on a referendum is that the no vote tends to get a little higher. The polls seem to be showing issue 1 ahead, but most of the polls I've seen also show it with a high undecided percentage, and that the yes vote I haven't seen in most polls cross over 50% yet. So,
which is usually the threshold to say you've got a majority, therefore,
so it's still pretty open, and there's real complexities and opposition, little aspects of this in terms of the politics, where you've got Cordray in favor of it, DeWine against it, DeWine running hard in terms of negative television commercials against Cordray for his support of it. the police are against it, but the police union has endorsed Cordray, so the politics are really cross-cutting on this. Right. I wonder if what might be happening nationally is that we're seeing maybe the beginning of sort of a shift in public opinion about issues like the punitive approach to criminal justice, in a similar way in which the opinion on same-sex marriage started to shift. Then usually right before the shift, I think you see sort of a reaction to do things like entrench in the Constitution in the states opposition to same-sex marriage, but those end up historically looking like sort of the last gasps of the movement that was opposed to the concept. So I'm not suggesting necessarily that the issue is going to pass. In fact, it may fail. But I think that there's a significant shift happening, especially with things like the opioid epidemic, the extent to which drugs have penetrated into communities in a much broader way that has caused those communities now to think about them differently than they thought about things like the crack epidemic. Now it affects them, so they care about it, frankly. So they want to take a less punitive approach because it's their families who are affected
opioids
now.
have become this, have crossed all geographic barriers, all socioeconomic barriers, all of those things that we used to associate drug usage with. This is a whole different world, and it puts the candidates in it, because I know Bob Ladd has been running, of course, obviously, has talked about, he's been involved in passing bills at the House of Representatives in front of, on the front end of the opioid thing to make it easier to deal with. So issue one is that's going to be one that's going to be kind of too close to call. Is that sort of the general feel for it at the moment, or?
I think you've seen a lot of effort to try to tie it also beyond just like the specific opioid epidemic or drugs in Ohio to the idea and the problems of mass incarceration. And so you've had the connection with, we know, mass incarceration targets disproportionately communities of color, and that this will kind of help address that. And you've seen a little bit of hinting at that. Whether it would remains to be seen. About 5 other states have tried similar things to issue 1, and they've seen mixed results. And there are a lot of kind of other ramifications in terms of how they work in the criminal justice system and whether or not you have people choosing treatment as an option to probation or incarceration. And so they've kind of affected that. But there haven't been enough states that have done this where we have a good idea,
a good sample size to say this works or this doesn't. So.
Of kind of what the outcome would be. And so I think there's been a lot of struggle of how to market this. So I think the polls are tapping into uncertainty. That's a legitimate case of uncertainty.
So I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there because we're running out of time. It's a lot to talk about in this election, even though it has a few high points. Thank you to Melissa Miller, Nicole Kalaf-Hughes, David Jackson. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see what happens on Tuesday, that first Tuesday in November, and see how things come out with this election. So thank you again for being here and giving us your information, your wisdom on this election, and we'll get back together again and see how this all works out. You can check us out at WBGU.org, and of course you can see us every week on WBGU-TV, public television. We'll see you again next time.